I wanted to first start off by talking a little bit about the background of these projects. This, of course, ties into the exhibit Pioneers in the Sky, and there is some overlap with some of my lectures that I've given here and elsewhere over the years, but this is really going to be a particular perspective on aerial archaeology, and specifically to the Black Desert. So we'll talk a little bit about the timeline, the starting of aerial photography in the Black Desert, and then I will talk a little bit about how this has really helped us understand the region from these two different projects, the Eastern Body Archaeological Project and the Kites in Context Project. The Black Desert, so-called, is basically a volcanic landscape. It's covered basalts that have spread across this region of southern Syria, across Jordan, and into northern Saudi Arabia over the course of from about 500,000 years ago back about 23 million years ago. You'll see a number of flat-top mesas today in some of the illustrations and photos that I show. They're not volcanoes. This is more of just a basaltic landscape. One of the earliest photos is an unknown photographer, but comes from the early 20th century. And this is right around the area of Ozrock. It's pretty hard to even recognize what would have been Ozrock, which was a marshy area at that point. More familiar to me, because this is one of the first places I visited when I went out to the Black Desert many years ago, is the first published aerial photograph of a place that is now known as Maitland's Mesa, or Mesa 4. And that's what you're looking at here, and you can see all kinds of structures on top. This was the first published aerial photograph from the Black Desert and was taken by Percy Maitland, an RAF pilot who flew the route from Cairo to Baghdad for the RAF mail pouch. A bit later on, there was another early photograph from a plane by the French father Antoine Podebard, which I'm sure I butchered the name, of a very well-known early bronze site of Jawa. This is just near the southern border of Syria and northern Jordan. We didn't know until much more recently that there's a series of photographs taken from U-2 spy planes. These come from the 50s, early 60s, but were actually only recently declassified, well, recently, in the late 90s, and have slowly been coming on into use, particularly through the hard work of Emily Hammer, who's been scanning this. And so this is one of the images. And you can see this beautiful image of a kite from these U-2 illustrations. This is probably the first aerial photo taken using a kite, that is, a kite like a kid's kite with suspending a camera. This is of a Neolithic site known as Dwela, and is probably a late Neolithic site. And this was taken by Sven Helms and Alison Betts, two pioneers in the Black Desert. In the late 90s, a surprising project started with the Royal Jordanian Air Force. It started with David Kennedy, a Roman archaeologist, who, with the Royal Air Force, started taking photographs across Jordan, really wonderful photos with good quality cameras. And eventually it turned into a larger scale project, one that flew many missions and is still flying missions, even though David Kennedy has stopped doing this, sort of retired from the project, and Bob Bewley most recently was doing this. In fact, they will ask archaeologists, where would you like to have some photographs done, and they'll fly over a site and produce wonderful photographs. This is unusual. Most countries in the region will not let civilians go up with high quality cameras and fly around with royal helicopters. In the early 21st century, then, we started to have more available satellite imagery. Satellite imagery had been around for quite some time, of course, but it wasn't really accessible to most of us very easily, and certainly not very affordably. So the first high-resolution open access satellite images started to come online with Google Earth. And of course, we've all used these to look at where we used to live as a kid, or to look at other cities, all sorts of wonderful uses, including being able to understand how many structures, buildings, and objects there are across places like the Black Desert. But satellite imagery can only go so far, and it still has its limitations in resolution. And so this is one of the earliest UAV photos taken from a drone in about 2013 at the site of Wasad pools. This was taken from, I believe, I was trying to figure it out. It was in 2013, and I was trying to figure out whether it was, what kind of drone it was using. And I think that over here, let's see. Yeah, right about there, I think, is the shadow of the plane flying over the site. Now, what you're looking at is a structure that we had just started, we had sections, so you can see there's half of the structure that we've started to excavate. And then you can also see, I think you can probably just make out the planning frame for drawing. And then over here, this odd-looking structure is where we are very methodically putting all of the mini boulders that we're taking out away from the site and sort of instead of scattering them all over the landscape. So why has so little work been done in this region if it's so fabulous? And as I'm going to try to suggest tonight, why have not so many other people worked out there? Well, some of it might have to do a bit with bias, because in fact a lot of archaeologists are interested in large tell sites that have much later periods and are much more visible on the landscape. But the area also tends to be marginal to discussions of early agriculture, because this is an area too arid for agriculture, at least we think. And also there's no cities, no large tell sites. So this is kind of stuff that a lot of archaeologists would be more interested in the Mesopotamian region, Upper Mesopotamia. There's also perhaps a disinterest in what were presumed to be pastoral nomadic sites, as they tend to be very ephemeral and not have very much material culture. And this evening we'll understand by the end how this is not really a very good assumption about the sites that we're going to look at. And of course, to be fair, remote situations like this where you're camping is not everybody's cup of tea. The logistics can be difficult, of course. Here you see us arriving at a site more recently in 2022, where you see the transport truck in the center is dumping us off in a dry lake bed, because that's as far as he was willing to go. And so all of our material for the next month has been dropped off, and then we have to transport it further into where we actually want to camp for the next month in our two smaller Hilux rentals. So what we're going to look at this evening is outside of the Fertile Crescent. It's in that sort of triangular area south of Mesopotamia and to the west of that green verdant area along the Mediterranean. The projects that we're going to look at this evening are two areas in the Black Desert, but they're really, you can see, on the edge of the Black Desert, or at least on the edge of some of the most difficult basaltic areas to cross. And so on the southern end, right near the border with Saudi Arabia, you see the Eastern Badia Archaeological Project of Wadi al-Katafi and Wasad pools. And Badia, by the way, simply means sort of badlands or desert, and you may hear me use that term a few times. It's basically all of the arid zones that are east of the Mediterranean zone, the highlands of Jordan. And then the kites in context, you can see crosses a fairly large area, and you can just see the single road that goes from Amman, Azraq, over to Baghdad. That's the sole tarmac road, which you can make out in the satellite imagery. So one of the first places we've already seen this is Maitland's Mesa. This is what we now call Mesa 4. We've given them all numbers. And you can see how when we arrived at this site, you can see a whole bunch of structures on top of the site as well as down around the lower shoulders. So we had to start trying to figure out how are we going to make some sense of this? How are we going to map all of this? And of course, one way is to, of course, use total stations. But with that many structures, it's a bit overwhelming. And of course, we're operating in an area where there are no fixed points, and so it's operating within its own universe. And we realized that this was going to be an overwhelming task. It's way too many structures to be able to try to do good recording. Now, one way that we could overcome that is what's known as pole-assisted photography, what looks like desert fishing, because that is indeed a big fishing rod that we bought. in Jordan and affixed a small camera to the end of it. And of course, this has the advantage of being relatively simple. It's a simple camera, it's accessible, you need to be able to recharge the battery or bring a lot of extra batteries, but it doesn't require a whole great deal of expertise to put the camera secure on the end of the pole and then cast it over methodically over a structure or over a feature in order to be able to build a 3D model, create an orthomosaic. Of course, it does have this downside in that it's still a pretty limited area that you can cover. You're not really going to be able to walk all around the desert doing this, and it's a little bit difficult to be certain that you're getting sufficient overlap in order to come up with a really high-quality orthomosaic. Also, you have to have a camera or have to have a hack on the camera so that you can set it and take images every 2 or 3 seconds, whatever you want. So around this time, Chad Hill suggested that we might be able to start using drones. He then had been starting to build his own drones, UAVs, and had brought a hexacopter out to Wasad pools to fly in the Black Desert. So this is probably the first one that we know of that was flying in the Black Desert. And you can see one that he built. Now, to be fair, he was also starting to use this with Morag Kursal as a way of monitoring looting. Now, this is not in the Black Desert. This is down on the Dead Sea. And so this is also some of the earliest use of drones in Jordan that Morag and Chad were using to look, to monitor the looting of these very important early bronze sites such as Feifa and Baba Dra, which are down along the Dead Sea. So in order to try to get a better handle and recording and mapping, we decided to embark on an effort to map a larger area using both fixed wing and rotary UAVs. Our goal was to try to map this entire area, 32 square kilometers, using drones so that we would get much higher resolution maps than is possible with a satellite imagery. Satellite imagery can maybe these days get you down to 30 or 40 centimeters per pixel, whereas a drone can get you down to about 1, 2, or 3 centimeters per pixel. So much higher resolution is possible. Of course, this is pretty ambitious. And there's one way to land them. And sorry about that, trying to talk over the obnoxiously loud fixed wing. Now, the fixed wing is really difficult to fly, and so this is not for everybody. Chad has been doing this since he was very young, and even so, there are sometimes problems, and this is why you have built-in redundancy, so that we brought also the early version of a DJI. We had also brought a second plane. Unfortunately, that was taken away from us by customs, even though we had a permit to bring it in. So our built-in redundancy didn't work entirely, and amazingly enough, once we went back to Amman, Chad was able to find some parts, some gizmos, some tape, and some glue gun, and that thing actually flew again. In the background, you see Isa Radwan. He is also a poet, although he was our DOA representative for the Department of Antiquities. He is also a known poet in Jordan, and he wrote the poetry that you'll see in the exhibit. I think somebody else is the one who's actually reading his poem for the exhibit. So we considered it a success, although we didn't actually cover everything that we wanted to. So you'll see that this is the final map that we made and marked up with all of the features. You'll also notice that there's one thing that seems to be left out here is one of the mesas, which we did not cover. We were just getting a little too nervous. We were running out of time, and of course we were missing entirely one drone that we never were able to bring into the country. Nonetheless, we got pretty good results and have good high-resolution maps. As you can see on the right, that's Maitland's Mesa all marked up. This is a sort of simplified version of Maitland's Mesa with some of the major features marked up. And so in red, you can see what we are considering possibly garden walls. This is a suggestion by our colleague Bernd Mühlenhoff, yes, from Berlin, who found similar features in northern Jordan and suggests that maybe they are gardens. And you can even notice on the top of Maitland's Mesa these sandy areas, and this is where water is being captured. So we're wondering if perhaps this is why these walls were on this mesa and not on other mesas. And so that's just a small encapsulated picture of one. We also found these things we call ghura huts. Ghura are what the local Bedouin call these flat-topped mesas. And the ghura huts, we don't really know what they were for. You can see one that we excavated, and you can see that it's sort of two features that are connected. It's got an entrance over on this side, and then a connection here. This seems somewhat paved. We found no objects in it. And nothing we could date, so pretty hard to interpret when you don't have any objects or datable material. And then the cairns, these so-called tomb tails, which are in purple along the edge of the mesa. These are a known sort of feature, thought to be later, probably not Neolithic like some of the other features that we'll be looking at this evening. And then right here, you can see where the Neolithic structure, it was the first one that we excavated when we started working out in the area. And this is something I've talked about before and is available on some of the other lectures on the ISAC website. We realized that there were a lot more of these structures, and this is why we needed to be able to map them. So, for instance, about 1 kilometer north of Maitland's Mesa is another area, Mesa 7, and you can see all these piles of structures, and you can even notice where we've started excavating one, just half of it, and some sort of interesting feature over here. And so the advantage to all of this high resolution is to be able to make a DEM, a digital elevation model, showing all the structures marked into the map on the right side. In the end, we also realized that although we knew of some kites in the area, we also recognized more kites because they were ones that had been missed in the satellite imagery that other people had studied. And so there are about 10 kites, we think, right in this immediate area that we were working at. And you can see how there are kites here, here, and then like about 3 of them here, one on this side, one on the top, and one on the side. But also there seem to be walls that sort of force the animals into these kites rather than letting them pass through the mesas. People were using them. But wait, why am I talking about kites? Many of you already know about kites, but I should mention this because, in fact, some of you probably don't know what a kite is. It's called a kite because these early pilots flying over the region thought that the shape was similar to like a child's kite. The kites typically have these 3 major features. They have drive lines, what are called guiding walls, that would guide the animals into this big enclosure. These enclosures come in a variety of different shapes, and people have tried to make typologies out of looking at them on satellite imagery. They don't seem to really fall into typological categories to me. They very often, shapes are very often formed according to the landscape features. And then really most important are the cells, these small little cells and traps that all of the kites have. And this has been one of the debates. What are those little cells for? Are they for hunters to hide in so that when the animals are in the enclosure you can pop up and get them? Or are they traps that the gazelle then fall into because they can't see these little spaces at the end of the enclosure? Now when we mention the kite walls, it's really important to understand that they're not walls. They are this little line of rocks like you see here in this picture, which you can barely make out in some cases. If it's all sandy, you can see them easily. They're black rocks. They stand out. In an area like this, you're looking at one of those kites that stand out beautifully from aerial photographs and really difficult to make out on the ground. These are just a few examples of some of the kites that we've looked at, that we included in that analysis around the mesas. You can see a very large one. This is on top of the largest mesa in that series. You can see the guiding walls go shooting off at least 1 kilometer or 2 in multiple directions, pushing the animals up to the top of the mesa, and then keeping them right up to the edge of the mesa. Just another angle of the very same one. In other places, people use sort of troughs between the landscape features, such as these mesas 11 and 12. You can see the walls are using the edges of the mesas to push the animals in towards that big enclosure, and with just a few cells right at the end of it, just 3 or 4 of them. And we can then turn this into a nice DEM to highlight the walls and to show other connective walls that help prevent animals from going different directions, so that there's these long walls and walls closing it off to push animals towards where the hunters actually wanted them to end up. In some cases, you can see that it's only partially using the landscape. This is a small mesa, and there's probably actually were 2 kites, one earlier kite that you can see close to the mesa, and then it was rejuvenated, reworked. So we know from a project known as the Global Kites Project by French archaeologists Remy Crescent and Wael Abou-Aziz and other colleagues that there are kites in the thousands. They form chains going across the Black Desert. In Jordan alone, there's about over 2,000 kites, and you can see how they form lines and connections, roughly running north-south. So this is a known phenomena, and it's something that's been looked at very carefully by various people using satellite imagery, but it needs a much further investigation. So next, we're going to go over now to Wasad Pools. Now, Wasad Pools is about 60 kilometers further to the east from Wadi Katafi. It looks a little bit different, of course, because it doesn't have mesas. It's still a basaltic landscape. You can see all the horrible black rocks that you have to get around, trip around, drive over. And this is where our camp is, right along the first pool of the series of Wasad Pools. You can even see that there's still some water left there when we arrive in late spring. So this is just what Wasad Pools looks like on the ground. Lots of rocks, relatively flat. There's a little bit of change in the landscape. So this particular space would have been incredibly alluring to people and animals because of those pools. Now that one where I showed you the water where our camp is was this one right here, and that was the little sandbar where the camp is. And then it curves around like so, and there's a series of pools. They're not clearly marked out as to how many, there's something like 9 pools. Now in Wasad Pools, in the area, you can see how many structures there are. There's a whole variety of different types of structures. We don't think that they're all dating to one period, but we have excavated 3 of them circled in red. And I'm not going to go through all of these. That's for another talk. I'll just mention a few highlights. And the 3 that we have excavated are all Neolithic structures. So it's interesting. We can't argue that all of these are Neolithic. We think some of them are later, but a lot of them are Neolithic. So this is the structure 80, W80 as we refer to it, what it looked like before we did anything to it. And then you've already seen the image with one of our first drone flights over W80 when we first started clearing it, first started doing the section. Now we spent on this single structure, I believe 5 seasons excavating because we're a very small group. We tend to be 8 to 10 people. And it's very slow going. Some of these stones are too large to even for 4 or 5 people to pick up. You just have to keep flipping them out and leveraging them out and try not to smash toes or archaeology in the process. So it's a pretty slow process. But eventually we have cleared the structure. This is what the structure looked like in an earlier phase. So you can see it's got a very wide doorway. It's got a central pillar. Some other pillars built into the wall here, 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 and then this central pillar. So that wide doorway was closed in a later refashioning of the building. I show you this structure, even though it's not exactly like the others, it's the richest one. It's the one that we've recovered the most artifacts from. Lots and lots of arrowheads, of course, hunting implements, and a variety of arrowheads that probably someday will be able to be figured out as a chronological change, but this is not something we've sorted out yet. Many archaeologists would guess that these are probably a later type of arrowhead, but we really haven't been able to sort that out in our stratigraphy yet. Lots of beads, lots of drills for making beads, lots of beads that aren't even finished, such as this one down here. It's partially drilled, but it hasn't been finished. These are shells coming from the Red Sea, possibly also from the Mediterranean. This is to be sorted out. Carnelian, you can see some of the red there is carnelian, something we also need to figure out where's the carnelian coming from. It's possible that it's in the basaltic environment somewhere that hasn't been discovered yet. And then you'll notice some of these blue-green type stones, something called Daba marble, which also comes from a known source out in the desert. So this is something that we're going to work on, trying to provenience some of the beads and shells that were used. Probably some of the most important information that we've gleaned from this particular site was done by Louise Martin and Özlem Sarıtaş. They put together this particular graph. This is important because, okay, in the yellow, you see that each of the three sites, three structures, this is at Katafi, this is at Katafi, and these two are at Wasad. The yellow is gazelle, so people are dependent on hunting gazelle at each of these sites. Very popular, very tasty. But the black and white diagonals are something that we had wondered about, and now we have pretty good secure evidence that people were also herding animals. They were herding sheep and goat out here in the what looks like desert now and probably was not then. So really we're talking about people who are hunting gazelle, hunting wild onager, that is donkey, hunting hare, hunting foxes, have dogs, and probably using dogs both for herding and hunting, and in places also have a little bit of big cats such as Asiatic lion, leopard, and a few other types of animals. But the combination of herding and hunting is an important factor of how people were probably managing to spend more time out here than we had ever assumed before. We also have pollen collected by Matt Jones and his graduate students at Nottingham University. And we have pollen both for something called typha, which is bulrush and cattails, large genus, and salix, willow. Both of these indicate marshy and wetter circumstances than we know of out there. So this really suggests that it was wet, at least at the Wasad Pools area, probably year-round. Willow is not something that would be able to survive really arid conditions for very long at all. That same structure, this is in a later phase when it has been rebuilt. You can see how the doorway that was once very wide has been sort of narrowed down, closed off. So now it's a narrow doorway. There's another doorway to something that we called a porch, which almost certainly is not a porch. Still with the central pillar and other pillars. Some grinding slabs that were not in that building in an earlier phase. And you can see our very recently published radiocarbon dates over on the side. Of course, I don't expect you to immediately absorb all of these numbers, but I'll point out just one or two things about the numbers. That top one is a very new date that we just published in the journal Levant. That's actually late pre-pottery Neolithic B. So this is at the very base of this structure, suggests that it was the pre-pottery Neolithic B, an earlier structure where this structure was then built, refashioned, probably completely changed at some points, and used over the course of about 1,000 years. Not constantly, but rebuilt, reused, and constantly sort of refashioned. These are the dates that we just recently published, and again, I don't want to get too far into radiocarbon dates, but you can see that we have many more radiocarbon dates for the Wasad pool structures that we've excavated. They're surrounded in the red frame. Up at the top, we only have 5, 6 dates for the Katafi structures. But what's also interesting is that it seems like there's a big gap there in the Wasad pools dating, where there's really no dates right around this period of time known as the 8.2K event. So at about 6,200 BC, there was a cold event recognized globally, and it seems like maybe people were not going out to Wasad pools during that time. Now, of course, this is just based on 3 structures and perhaps a dozen radiocarbon dates, but that's not bad. It's something to work with, and even more perplexing is then you have a bunch of dates over in Katafi that seem to fit right in that period of time when it seems like people might not have been using Wasad pools. How we're going to interpret that, I don't really know yet, but it's an interesting thing that we've just recently recognized. So this is just to show you the Neolithic chronology. Much of what we've been looking at, of course, has been late Neolithic, although that early 1 or 2 radiocarbon dates is the late pre-pottery Neolithic B. Now, continuing to look at Wasad, there's a whole series of petroglyphs at the site, more than 400 petroglyphs. Not all of them are very easy to understand or interpret what it is you're looking at. And we've written a paper on this, and I've talked about it, but I did just want to highlight one thing in particular. Most of them, of course, are of animals, ibex in particular. They love depicting ibex, as well as some kudu and some other animals that's pretty hard to tell what they are. But what they also like to depict, and about 1/5 of the petroglyphs are kites. And this again highlights the importance of the kites to the reason for being in the region, and presumably also at a place like Wasad where we're getting all these gazelle bones. And so now why depict the kites? Your interpretation is as good as mine. Is it kind of instructional? Is it something that is sort of instructional to show people how to use a kite, or how we're going to make this kite, what it will look like as we build it out on the landscape? Is it just something you do while you're bored, waiting for the animals to show up, peck some nice things that you love on some hard basalt stone? I would think that would scare animals away, so they would be very noisy. And you can also see in some cases when we were looking at these depictions of kites on the basalt, it seems sometimes like they're using the contour of the basalt to make the kite as they would have on the landscape. Not always, but in some cases it really seemed like that's what they were doing. Now at Wasad pools, there's a whole series of kites. You can see there's kind of a chain like we had seen on the larger map earlier. And so we did an estimation. How many kites from Wasad, marked by the red star in the center, how many kites could people get to? And within just a few hours, say 3 hours walk, 40 plus kites are available. So it suggests that people were probably culling gazelle, and we think it's only gazelle. So far that's the main thing that we have evidence for, although it could have been onager as well, the wild donkey. And then bringing them back to process them, to slaughter them, perhaps even to dry the meat for trade or for saving for later times in the year. This is something we really don't know. It would make sense that they were doing this, but we don't have any proof of that yet. So all of this information on kites and the sort of recurring, we just keep coming back to kites and gazelle and kites, is what inspired the idea to start and ask for funding for a project called Kites in Context. And this is an attempt that we just started in 2022 to have a multi-scalar investigation. So we will use satellite imagery to study them, of course, as other projects have done. And this is a way of being able to map them and to know how many there are, where they are located. And then we want to implement drone imagery to be able to map and record at much higher resolution on the landscape a smaller subset of kites. There's no way we'll be able to map all of those more than 2,000 kites using drones, not the way that we use drones now. And of course, these are very sort of consumer cheap drones, nothing to do with the high-end military types of drones. So that's one part of it. And then the other part, of course, is to do on-the-ground truthing, to survey the area around not only the kites, but also the features and structures that are next to the kites, where people would have been living or where they would have been processing the animals that they have caught or killed. And so we want to do survey and we want to do excavation. We've started doing that. No more fixed wing planes, really. The satellite, drone industry has moved on, and Chad has admitted that in fact DJI is a very good drone. You see him flying two of them, well, flying one of them here. It's the RTK implemented DJI. You can just send it up with a phone with a plan. You can decide whether you want 40% or 60% overlap and make an incredible map using that drone, which can stay up in the air for quite some time. And on the left, you can see the much smaller mini drone, Mini 2, that produces incredible video and photographs, not so good for mapping, but very easy to fly and to get a lot of great imagery from. And so this is the kind of thing that you can get wonderful imagery from. The RTK gets wonderful pictures, but of course it's looking straight down and mapping. Whereas with that much smaller DJI Mini, you can get wonderful imagery, and you can still map with it. It's just more difficult. Here's a good example of a kite that you can see all of the nice little cells around the edge of the enclosure and these long guiding walls, drive lines for guiding the animals into the enclosure. You'll notice that one of these is something that Marie-Laure Chambrade mentioned recently as being not like the others, and we see this repeatedly on some of these kites. Most of them are these small, round cells, and here and there on some kites we see these larger, long, rectangular features, and we really don't know what those are about either. So this is something else that we really need to investigate more as we start to look at the kites. Just a few examples. I always like to show this one. I find it fascinating because it has this wheel feature. We'll see some more examples of that built into the actual kite, or the kite's built around the wheel, I'm not sure which. And then another kite on the bottom which has an incredible number of cells, although it looks like it's been rebuilt a number of times. Even side-by-side kites, these are opening out to the east. Almost all of these in this region, the guiding walls open, diverge out towards the east. So presumably this is the direction that the gazelle are coming from the direction of what now is Iraq. We're also mapping other features, so it's not all kites all the time. It is also other features that are near the kites, associated with the kites, and that we also want to map, such as these things called tailed tombs, which is very similar to the cairns, the tailed tomb that we saw on the edge of Maitland's Mesa. And then, of course, the wheels. We just saw an example of one built into a kite. These are really enigmatic things that we don't know what they're for. We've done a few OSL dates of two of them, and they seem to date somewhere around 4,000 to 3,000 BC, and that's a very rough guess of only two of them, so we have a long ways to go for being able to figure out what the date is for these. I think actually one of the dates edges back into the late Neolithic, so even earlier. But we have a long ways to go to understand them. There's actually sort of two kinds that Dr. Chambrade and her colleague Stefan Smith have studied as part of their project. The Western Hara Survey looked at these and recognized that there's two kinds of these wheels. There's the wheels like you see on the right. They have these radial sorts of spokes, and then encircled enclosure clusters like the one on the left. A little bit similar, and you can see how they both have this tendency to have these little cairns, little features oriented around the edge. Those don't seem to be just piles of rocks from the center. They seem to actually be built structures. So when we decided that we would go excavate and work on some kites as part of the Kites in Context project, we eventually got all of our gear into this beautiful setting, a very dusty setting, and decided that this would be the first kite that we would start to have some excavations at. You can see our camp in the background there and that dusty ka, and this was our daily morning commute to get up to the kite, about 1.5 or 2 kilometers, I think. Very nice in the morning, really horrendous in the afternoon coming back, although much lighter because you've drunk all the water and it's time to go back. And so we chose this one because it's not really manipulated. It hasn't been changed or turned into herders, places for animals. It hasn't been looted. And so we really like the looks of this kite. We chose 3 of the cells to excavate. And I must admit that excavating these cells was not only really difficult, but really boring. because there's nothing in them. There's a lot of soil, there's a lot of dirt, which we sieve all of it, and that doesn't exactly make it more exciting when you're not finding anything. You can see that we're sectioning these, so we're only doing half so that we can get a sense of where the wall of the cell is, and hopefully when we've reached the bottom. So the one on the left is pretty easy to see that you've hit the bottom. It seems to be basalt bedrock. The one on the right, we think that we hit the bottom. There's a significant soil change. But no radiocarbon dates, nothing we could date, so we took OSL samples, and we'll hopefully have those soon, and no artifacts to speak of. Now, for our next year, we were, you can see our camp way back here. This is still in our first year, and we decided the next year that we would excavate this kite. So here you can see a kite with very short walls. It's been massively disturbed because people are taking the rocks and building animal pins all around, but you can still make out the cells around the edges, and this is all oriented right at the Roman pool. This is what the locals call it, and seems accurate enough as far as we can tell from the pottery and some of the grinding stones. It looks like there probably were Romans there at some point. We've also done an analysis of the rock art that is here. It's not really that similar to the Wasad pools, excuse me, rock art. There's a tomb here, so there's some Safavidic inscriptions focused around that tomb that has been looted. And then the kite, of course, that we've excavated some of the cells. This is just one of the cells that we excavated. I don't need to show you every single one of them if there's nothing to show you, but this one turned out to be quite interesting for two reasons, really. One, it really had a very nicely built wall. You'll notice those other cells that I showed you had piles of rocks, but they didn't look much like walls. This one had a much more substantial and clear wall ringing it. Again, you can see we've just excavated half. And the other interesting thing is this large, flat rock that is clearly placed there intentionally. Seems like a strange thing to do. Nice thing to do if it's your house, you want a nice threshold stone, but an odd thing to do if really all you want is for animals to run in and fall into your pit. But I think that we understand it a little bit better now, and the idea is that this picture shows the threshold stone, as we've called it, and then a series of rocks that were intentionally mounded, sort of at a slanting face, up to the threshold stone. I'm assuming that a lot of this would have been covered by earth, and that this would have prevented the gazelle to be able to see. Gazelle are pretty short, they're not very tall, so they can't see very far. So all you need to do is be able to prevent their eye line from being able to see that they're about to fall into a pit. And so I think that that's actually what was going on here. But again, we found no artifacts in the cell that we excavated, and no radiocarbon dates, so we're going to use OSL again. So we have a lot of OSL dating that we'll be working on with a colleague in Jordan. So we're looking at kites now as something we dare to call infrastructure. We don't really think of the Neolithic as something that has infrastructure. But the kites, the sort of the phenomenal building episodes, however long it took to make them, really seems to be infrastructure out in what now looks like a desert was probably much more like a savanna at the time, because we have this evidence of plants and of animals that would thrive in a savanna atmosphere and which would not be very happy or even able to maintain in a desert. Then we think that this is probably part of what enabled more people to spend more time out in this region. So they had animals that they were herding, sheep and goat. From that they would have milk and yogurt, perhaps also hair or wool, and at the same time they were hunting. And they seem to have really ramped up the hunting. The hunting seemed to be well beyond what the few earlier Neolithic people had been doing, so that they were creating this massive machine to cull as much animals, gazelle presumably, in the region as possible. So this would have extended people's ability to stay in the region for longer periods of time, and probably would have expanded the regional interactions that people had with each other. Going out to build these large projects would have taken quite a number of people, not only to build them, but also to maintain them and actually to operate them, to keep that pressure on the wild animals. We have to wonder, and maybe someday we'll be able to sort out, did this have an impact on the wild animals? The herding of animals and all of this hunting probably had some impact on the herds of gazelle. And excuse me, this would have signaled probably a different kind of use of the landscape and demarcation of the landscape. For all we know, some people actually sort of might have had these kites marked off belonging to bands or to families or to extended lineages. Maybe we'll never be able to figure that out, but it does seem like there's an awful lot of them, and they couldn't all have been built at the same time. So I just want to close with our most recent experience in the desert last year. We didn't go in the field this year, but last year we were there in late spring, as we usually are, and late spring often brings these rather dusty atmospheres that can be really unpleasant, really dust storms like you see here. But this one also brought 2 days of rain, and we usually get a little bit of rain in the late spring. It's not that pleasant because everything gets mucky and messy, and we don't have tents that are really made for that. But this time it rained for 2 days, and that was not really what we expected. And so we got quite the floods after the rain had stopped for 2 days, and we suddenly heard a lot of water coming our way. You can see where our camp is, and you can see the water is headed right for us. It wasn't dangerous. It wasn't rushing in the sense that we couldn't outrun it, but we also had to move quite quickly because you can see where our vehicles are. You can see where the tent that keeps all of our electronic gear, our food, all the important stuff, this old army tent. And in the end, we got everything out. We moved the trucks in time, and just the sad army tent was left by itself for a while until things dried out, and then we could pack up the army tent too. So this was the kind of thing that you really have to be very grateful for very tough young people who did a lot of the hardest work and did it still with a smile on their face. We really owe them a lot, including the people who would still insist on making a hot dinner despite the fact that they're in that sad army tent mucking around in the mud. And we, in fact, published a photo essay in the Journal of Field Archaeology about these experiences. So it's really just photos of that experience, one of the first photo essays that JFA has done. And you should be able to access it. If you don't, of course, get in touch with me and I can send you a copy. So these are this is actually just some of the important people and sponsors who have supported us through the years. And of course, a lot of it we really handed over to a lot of the people who go out in these circumstances and seem to joyfully not mind having no shower for a month and being essentially vegan for a month, which is not everybody's choice, but it works out pretty well. And so with that, I just wanted to leave it at that, and thank you all very much.